As far as companies go, few will ever achieve status as strong as Cupertino's pride, Apple. However, despite that nature, there's still a lot of stuff scattered around Apple's decades-long history that's a lot less well-known as compared to the rest of their achievements. Like, did you know that almost every Apple promotional image displays the time 9:41? That when the first iPhone was being made, there was so much secrecy around it that the hardware team never met the software team, and the project was under the code name M68, or that Steve Jobs was known as employee number 0 while at Apple. And my personal favorite, did you know that Apple used to deliver products to consumers in limousines at one time? We could go on and on about did you knows from Apple's history, and so today we're going to be exploring 10 such things about Apple that you might have never known, starting with 1. It was funded by selling a scientific calculator. Nowadays, Apple is known for having more workable cash than the GDPs of entire countries, but as you can imagine, back in its heyday, that wasn't the case. In fact, to gather money just to buy the parts needed to build the first few orders of the Apple I, Steve Jobs had to sell his Volkswagen van, and Wozniak, then a Hewlett-Packard employee, had to sell his Hewlett-Packard 65 scientific calculator. And while for today's kids, that might sound like a really small investment, especially compared to Jobs selling an entire car, you may be surprised to know that back in the day, that calculator would have fetched something like $500. You see, back in 1976, a scientific calculator was as advanced as everyday computing got, and most cost as much as a laptop, with the Hewlett-Packard 65 that Wozniak sold actually being marketed as the smallest programmable computer ever. And well, if you look through old catalogs, that particular model did in fact retail for a whole $799, nothing short of prime laptop territory nowadays. It's interesting to look back at how that one calculator being sold indirectly led to the demise of calculators in general, since nearly 30 years after that calculator was sold, the world was introduced to the iPhone, the de facto bane of technology from that era. Although I do wonder how much that calculator would fetch if it came up on eBay today. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. 2. They've fought with the Beatles. Now, at first glance, there couldn't be two entities further in scope than a tech company and a classic rock band, but both of them have one very special thing common between them: the Apple branding. You see, before Apple Computers was founded in 1976, in 1968, Apple Corp was incorporated across the Atlantic as the official record distributor for the greatest band on earth. And as you can imagine, after Apple started to grow in size, it led to a lot of corporate bitterness between the two groups over who owned the right to be called Apple. Starting in 1978, Apple Records filed the first of many lawsuits against Apple Computers, which eventually resulted in a payment of $80,000 to Apple Corp in an agreement that the two companies would stay out of each other's businesses, Apple Corp agreeing to never work with electronics, and Apple Inc. agreeing never to do music. And if you know anything about the stuff Apple has made, you know that that agreement didn't last. After a ton of lawsuits between the introduction of music playing on Apple Computers and the introduction of the iPod, and eventually iTunes, the companies met once again to discuss what was to be done. And the result was a decision that Apple would take possession of all the trademarks related to Apple, and then license some of them back to Apple Corp. And with Apple releasing all of the Beatles music on iTunes in 2010, it seems like the matter has finally been put to bed. 3. Their first logo featured Isaac Newton. Speaking of branding, there have been few logos as iconic and unchanging as Apple's famous bitten fruit. However, even though you may think the icon has remained the same in shape since the very first rainbow logo, there was a time when Apple went by a much different image. You see, for the first year of its existence, Apple's logo was one featuring none other than Sir Isaac Newton himself, moments before the historic moment when he allegedly uncovered his theory of gravity. As for who designed the logo, it was the third founding member of the company, Ronald Wayne. And if you're wondering why literally no one's heard of him, it's because the guy ended up selling his shares of the company to his partners, Jobs and Wozniak, for just $800. And well, if it looks outdated now, that logo was a departure from the mainstream even by 1970s standards. And as a result, just a year later, Steve Jobs hired graphics designer Rob Janoff, who created the iconic Apple silhouette. According to Jobs, the logo had that bite taken out of it so people did not confuse it with a cherry. And as for the retro rainbow colors, that was actually Jobs' edition, since he thought the monochrome design needed to look more human. And while the color didn't stick, the mere fact that the silhouette hasn't changed even once since it was made has got to speak for how successful that logo was. 4. The Legend of John Appleseed. If the logo is the most common piece of branding related to the company, the name John Appleseed is probably the most well hidden, so much so that many people might not even be aware that it's a thing. However, if you start to look deep into Apple's manuals, videos, and web pages, the name starts to pop up everywhere, prompting the question, who exactly is John Appleseed? And the answer to that question might be with the most unlikely group possible: middle schoolers. You see, younger students in the States are often taught about the exploits of one Johnny Appleseed, an 18th century American pioneer, missionary, and gardener who was responsible for the widespread cultivation of apples all across the continent. And well, that's basically the entire reason why he appears so often in Apple-related stuff. But as far as how it all started, the first Johnny Appleseed reference that we have relates back to Apple investor and former CEO Mike Markula, who used it as a pen name when he used to write programs for Apple II. And the first public instance of it on Apple items was the letter written on the leopard text edit icon, which, when opened, read, "Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things." And that letter, the one Apple also used extensively in many different places, is known to be signed as "Take Care, John Appleseed." As for nowadays, the name mostly appears on contact cards and the like on iPhone software mockups, and wouldn't you know it, there is a phone number attached to that contact as well. Although to out and every geek's collective disappointment, that number does not lead anywhere when called. 5. A history of fruity names that almost didn't happen. Now, Johnny Appleseed is far from the only Apple-inspired name used by the company, and the most prominent example of that is none other than the Mac, or as it was called back in the day, the Macintosh. Because while the first few Apple computers were simply named numerically, with Apple I, Apple II, and so on, and there was even an Apple Lisa named after Steve Jobs' daughter, when it came time for the latest and greatest attempt by Apple to revolutionize computing, it would end up being called the Macintosh. As for why, the name is actually attributed to Apple employee Jeff Raskin, who used the name of his favorite variety of apples as the code name for the device because of the whole fruity nature of the business. And while that's all it was supposed to be, a code name, with the actual release name being chosen by Steve Jobs, the staff loved the code name so much that Jobs had to budge. And as far as the name Jobs had intended to call the device is concerned, it was supposed to be Bicycle, which actually came from an ad Apple had placed in Scientific American magazine. In the ad, there was a quote by Steve Jobs which mentioned how computers were the bicycles for the mind, referencing the fact that even though many animals can outrun a human on foot, by using a bicycle, we can beat them all. And sure, that's a neat story. I don't know about you guys, but the name just doesn't do it for me. And that's exactly what the people at Apple thought, because once the Macintosh became a thing, nothing has been able to change that branding since, and won't be able to for the foreseeable future. 6. Their prices have always been concerning, although for different reasons. Now, many tech people have said this before, but Apple is not the same as it was a few decades ago, and the main reason they quote for that is Apple's prices, which have gone up dramatically ever since the last decade started. And while that is true for the most part, that doesn't mean this is the first time pricing has been a point of contention for the company. In fact, historically speaking, many of Apple's products, especially experimental and first-generation ones, have always boasted a high price tag. And the clearest example of that, in fact, is none other than Apple's very first computer, which, when adjusted for inflation, would have been more expensive than the MacBook Air or even a 17-inch MacBook Pro today. And that's actually not the only special part of the price tag, because back in 1976, the official price of the Apple I was exactly $666.66. And before you guys start with your Illuminati theories, that was actually a decision of practicality more than anything. As Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak once explained it at a news conference, "I was into repeating digits, and after adding a third to the wholesale cost of $500, the price of the machine would have come out to around $667, and seeing such a perfect opportunity, Woz simply had to turn it into a satisfying $666.66. 7. They like their Easter eggs. If you thought Johnny Appleseed was the only gimmick or Easter egg to be found in an otherwise cold and mechanical company, you'd be sorely mistaken. Because while the company nowadays is known for being really mature about their features, that wasn't the case just a couple of decades ago. And one particularly iconic example of that is actually the very first iPod. And the Easter egg is actually reminiscent of one of Apple's biggest competitors these days. That's right, the first iPod had a hidden game just like many Android phones have had for years now. And just like tapping tapping and holding the software information can open a simple game on your Android phone, pressing the right buttons in the right menu on the iPod also opened up a game for well-informed fans to enjoy. As for how exactly it was accessed, in a review by Nick Trianos in early 2002, go to the About menu, hold down the center button for about 3 seconds, and you'll get a breakout Pong game to play while you listen. And that name would be familiar to a few among you because Breakout is actually a game that was developed by Atari by none other than Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, who worked on the game when the two of them worked together at Atari. 8. The significance of 941. Now, speaking of Easter eggs, something that only the most dedicated of Apple fans may have noticed is that whenever Apple iPhones are released, they are traditionally shown with a clock set to 941. And while that might seem like a random Easter egg at first glance, there are actually a bunch of reasons behind it. And it starts, as so many things about Apple do, with Steve Jobs. You see, when the first iPhone was about to be released, the event was supposed to start at 9 in the morning. And the way it was structured would mean that the iPhone would be unveiled around, you guessed it, 941. And being Steve Jobs, the CEO and visionary insisted that the time that was shown in the unveiled images be the same that it actually was during that moment. And since then, not only has that time remained consistent on the lock screens of all subsequent iPhones, but the company also pays attention to the fact that the real reason behind the time remains the same and chooses to reveal the phones at the exact same time as Steve Jobs did all those years ago. And honestly, if that doesn't explain just why Apple is considered so far ahead of the competition in terms of attention to detail alone, I don't know what will. 9. They created many interesting products over the years. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple from his wilderness journey in 1997, he gathered the team together for a meeting and told them that the company was sinking because they had a lot of bad products. But just how bad were these products? Well, there were some pretty odd ones that you probably didn't know or are fortunate to be too young to remember. Lucky you. Let's take a look at Apple's attempt at a gaming console, the Pippin, a gaming box that cost more in 1997 than the Xboxes and PlayStations of today. Or the 10th anniversary Macintosh, branded as the TAM, a Mac Pro before there was the Mac Pro. Meant to be hand-delivered by a limousine and set up by a man wearing a tuxedo, this bad boy cost a mind-numbing $7,500 in 1997 for what was at the time a genuinely amazing PC. And while it sadly did not make it as a successful product for obvious reasons, it is still celebrated as a milestone in technology. Or the time when Apple became the first company to create a digital color camera. Back in the 90s, the QuickTake 100 was the best of its kind. State of the art? No, it was really bad. The massive chunky box could only take 8 photos before running out of storage, and even those at 640 by 480 resolution, and lacked any zoom, preview, or God forbid editing capability. And as a perfect little cherry on top, the thing cost $749, which is the equivalent of $1,000 today, which is a lot of money for a camera that needs to be attached to a Mac to properly function. And while all of those turned out to be major losses for the company, both financially and resource-wise, nothing compares to the sheer identity loss that was the Apple Collection, an Apple-inspired clothing line. That's right, at one point in the 1980s, Apple decided to release a collection of very era-appropriate clothes, which might be a sure sell in today's world of Apple fans, but back then was a surefire way to ruin your branding. And so I think there's a lesson to be learned here, that even the soberest of companies might have a little silly history behind it. This finally brings us to the last fact on our list. 10. The company was made on April Fool's Day. That's right, the birthday of the single most influential company in the last century is the same day millions of people celebrate as the Day of Stupidity. Because the fact of the matter is that the company we know as Apple was founded by Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne on April 1st, 1976, famously in Steve's garage. And while it didn't actually get incorporated as Apple Computer until almost a year later on January 3rd of 1977, this is the date widely accepted as the birth of Apple. And as far as why the company was named that way, according to Steve Jobs, he named the company because he had been enjoying fruit a lot lately, and after a visit to the local market, felt that the name was fun, spirited, and not intimidating. And that covers our video for today. And so with that, we must end today's video. I hope you enjoyed watching it, and if you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more. With that, take care, and I'll see you guys next time.